Chapter 7. If acid does anything, it dissolves filters and buffers through which perceptions are ordinarily channeled. Three-dimensional physical reality is suddenly expanded. It puts you in direct contact with the energies all around you. Nothing is dead or inanimate. It magnifies and expands your awareness in all directions at once. A grain of sand becomes a planet. A single voice becomes a symphony. If you resist it, the slightest fear can become a nightmare. These energies fuse, and you see yourself, not as separate, but as part of the great kaleidoscopic whole of life, melt twisted and free of pretension in timeless spirals of movement. You see that what was and what will always be is. With these filters removed, you are no longer divorced from what you perceive. Knowing this makes it easier to understand how Charlie was able to get inside people's heads. There were no barriers to obstruct him. His energies moved in and out like the tide. He was everywhere at once. When he said, "No sense makes sense," and "I am you, and you are me," he was, in terms of acid consciousness, absolutely correct. When he came to you in love, there was beauty. When the demon took control, it was frightening. I could not forget the look on Charlie's face the night he choked me. The episode confused me, made me more fearful, and at the same time, more committed to Charlie. Or, if not to Charlie specifically, to what was happening to me in the relationship. Years later, I read the autobiography of a yoga, and was struck by the story of a young man who went into the Himalayas searching for a guru. When he found the guru, he asked to become a disciple, saying that his life had lost all meaning. He said, too, that he had ultimate faith in the guru's knowledge and powers. As a test of that faith, the guru said simply, "Then jump off the mountaintop." The young man did so, and his apprenticeship began. Charlie had taught me something. I had faced my fears and had gained knowledge. Yet there was always the enigma of contradiction. Love and hate, elation and rage. Somehow the resolution of those opposites seemed at the core of my own spiritual growth, and while I little understood the dynamics of it, I was instinctively drawn to it. I had seen the split in Charlie. I had observed him as both saint and Satan. Perhaps it was those elements of my own psyche which responded. While there was never talk of revolution or murder during the first summer, helter-skelter didn't materialize until 3 months later, I certainly tasted Charlie's rage, as well as the imitations of my own mortality. I had seen the monster. But because my own ego was under such assault via the programming sensation within the family, I wasn't sure just who I was looking at. Was it Charlie? Was it me? Was it the rest of the family? Or was it something more awesome than any one of us? The morning after the acid trip, I took the pickup into town for George. I was still uneasy and spaced out, driving down the Ventura freeway. I started to change lanes and glanced into the rearview mirror. Suddenly, all the headlights behind me became glassy. Glaring eyes, and the cars took on their proper proportions. I saw them for what they were: living, breathing robots. Their grills twisted into leering smiles, the gleaming chrome teeth of civilization. And there I was, sitting inside one of them myself, doing 65 miles per hour. I pulled off the freeway into Ventura Boulevard. I felt sick. Yet, even after I had parked, I was aware of cars everywhere, stationed in lots, along curbs, hoisted atop hydraulic jacks, lurking in closed garages where I couldn't see them. Thousands, millions of them in every color. The world had been transformed into concrete to accommodate them. The air was polluted by them. I got out of the truck and puked in the gutter outside a market in Canoga Park. Then I drove back to Spawns on the back roads. When I told Charlie later that morning, he took me down to Malibu, and we sat at the beach and watched the sea. Months later, it occurred to me that nearly everyone in the Manson family came from the LA area or someplace like it, cemented in by freeways, tract homes, shopping centers, and parking lots, living in an atmosphere polluted perhaps beyond redemption by machines and the corporate monster. No wonder the youth of the 60s had flipped out to go searching for their souls. They had lost contact with their parents, their blood, their roots, with nature and the very air they sought to breathe. Humanity had become an echo chamber in the middle of an LA freeway. One of the most beautiful experiences of that summer happened in early August, just 2 weeks after the acid trip. I was sitting outside the ranch house with Clem under a eucalyptus tree, playing the guitar while watching a handful of blue jays squawking among the branches. Now I was feeling better about myself at that point, feeling as though I'd become stronger, yet more vulnerable to my own destiny. It was not a feeling of independence from Charlie, since I attributed much of my own growth to my relationship with him. Neither was it subservience to him. More, it was like a precarious balance that I had paid dearly to achieve. It became clear that I enjoyed a level of awareness that few shared. Clem, for example, was at the other end of the spectrum. In some sense, he was the dodo of the family. He acted most of the time like some bumbling, vapid-eyed hippie who didn't care what happened. It wasn't that Clem was dumb. It was just that he adopted Charlie's program of playing the idiot. Playing beneath the awareness of people. So completely that he became an idiot. Still, he was always a likable character. Unkempt, lanky, and awkward. He had long blonde hair, freckles, and was fair-complexioned. Before joining the family, shortly before I arrived at Spawns, he'd lived with the hippies in the back ranch house. He played the guitar and sang pretty well, and, unlike Brooks and Tex, was able to survive the sex scenes without undue trauma. He didn't tune in to the nuances of the group's sex, but when it came to a one-on-one situation, he could bawl his brains loose. We were both in good spirits that morning, feeling lucky to be alive. The day before, we'd borrowed Dennis Wilson's Ferrari to make a garbage run and then to drive around the mountains near Spawns. Clem was at the wheel, hauling ass up the mountain on Santa Susana Pass, speed shifting and burning rubber on the curbs. We came blazing up the hill into the steepest curve on the grade, doing about 80. Clem was beside himself. "Yahoo!" he bleated. I knew instinctively that we'd have to accelerate to make the turn. "Go for it, Clem. Tromp the son of a bitch!" We boogied into the turn, and my heart leapt into my throat. "Yow!" Clem bellowed. The tires squealed, and Clem lost it. Hitting the brakes, we skidded onto the shoulder, then spun out into the middle of the road before smacking into the guardrail. and I thought it was all over. But we bounced off again and came shuddering to a halt in the middle of the road. The car looked like a crushed tin can, nothing left but a twisted mass of glistening metal and broken glass. Miraculously, we were both unhurt. We climbed out through the windows, then hiked back to the ranch. Dennis and Charlie were sitting under a tree in front of the ranch house, along with Brenda, Snake, and Sandy, when Clem and I ambled down the road. "Hey, man," Clem said to Dennis. We kinda had an accident in your car." Dennis lay supine on the ground beside Charlie. He raised himself to his elbows. "What happened?" "Total it, man," I said. "Completely." Charlie drove us back up there in the pickup, but when we got to the curve, the wreckage was gone. Not a trace of it, except for the long set of serpentine skid marks. "Looks like some motherfucker came along and grabbed up your wheels, man," Charlie mused. "Too bad. That engine's probably worth some bucks." Later, we called the highway patrol. They knew nothing about it. Dennis filed a report, but to no avail. That was the last he ever saw of his car. I figured we survived the crash simply because Clem was too dodoed out to get snuffed. We were discussing the accident that evening under the tree when we spotted Sadie riding by on one of George's old geldings. I yelled at her, but she didn't seem to hear. Minutes later, she came trotting up the road on foot. She was wearing faded Levi's, about 3 sizes too big, and an old sweater pulled over her plump belly. After nearly 6 months of pregnancy, her breasts were huge, bouncing gingerly beneath her sweater as she hurried past us toward the house. "Where's Charlie?" "Up at the outlaw shacks. Why? What's up?" "I think I'm gonna have my baby." Clem and I exchanged glances as Sadie disappeared into the ranch house. "Go get Charlie!" Clem sprinted up the hill toward the outlaw shacks. I raced to the house. The girls had gathered around Sadie in the middle of the room. "Get the towels and boil some water in the big pot. Let's pull these mattresses together so she can lie down." Mary Brunner took charge immediately. Just 4 months earlier, she'd given birth to Pooh Bear under similar circumstances. "Give her some room, damn it," Katie said, tugging on the mattress. Sadie lay down in the middle of the floor. The girls helped her off with her clothes, and Brenda bought a pillow. Snake sat perched on a chair like a little bird, her eyes wide with anticipation, but her face all but hidden behind her hair. The other girls gathered around like Mexican women in an open marketplace. I looked over the tops of their heads. "You okay, Sadie?" "Yeah, Paul. But the baby is coming." "I know he's coming. Where's Charlie?" "I'm right here." The front door slammed behind Clem and Charlie. They'd both been running. "Back off a little, give her some room," Charlie ordered, kneeling down beside her. "How you making it, honey?" Charlie was shirtless, his body filmed in a light perspiration. He wore Levi's, cowboy boots, and a red bandana tied around his head. Sadie grimaced. Okay, Charlie. Okay. Paul, why don't you play some music, Dig? We want this little motherfucker to come out dancing, right?" Charlie went to the bathroom to wash his hands. Sandy and Squeaky came in with 2 buckets of hot water and a tray full of steaming towels, setting them on the small table. I picked on the sitar, It didn't take long. Soon the contractions were less than 10 minutes apart. Mary, Ella, Squeaky, Sandy, Stephanie, Katie, and Weish lifted Sadie up to support her body. Just raised her up into a half-sitting, half-reclining position. 2 girls on each leg, 2 holding her upper body. Gypsy held her head. Oh, Jesus! Charlie! Charlie! Sadie groaned. Nice and easy, Sadie. Just go with it. Go with the motion. Charlie squatted between her legs, laying his hands momentarily on the inside of her thighs. Somebody sterilize a razor and bring it in here. Snake bolted off the chair, got a razor blade from the bathroom, then took it to the kitchen to sterilize it. She was still in there when Sadie's water broke in a gurgle, spraying Charlie and the girls holding her legs. Shit, little dude's taking a swim, Charlie quipped. Sadie grinned. Sweat poured off her face. The veins in her arms stood out like tendons as she squeezed Brenda's hands. The next contraction was a doozy. Oh, God! Oh, Charlie! Strands of wet hair hung across Sadie's forehead. Gypsy brushed them back and wiped the skin with a towel. Push, honey, Charlie urged. Give it all you got. Push. He's starting to come now. Damn! I stood directly behind Charlie, watching over his shoulder. Snake handed him the razor blade. Easy, Mary soothed. It's coming fine. It's coming real good. You're about to be a mama. Hang on, honey. Charlie leaned over. His face flushed. He made a small incision at the apex of Sadie's vagina. Instantly, blood spurted from the tiny cut, drenching his hand. Oh, Charlie! Sadie wailed. Katie reached in to soak up the blood with a towel. Moments later, I could see the top of the baby's head pulsating in the opening, enveloped in a quivering, glutinous film. Push! Come on, push! Sadie, have your baby! He wants out! Then we could see his shoulders and his little arms. Jesus! Here he comes, Sadie. Come on out of there, brother. Suddenly, the top part of his body tore free in a spurt of crimson. Wow. Push! More! Then, as though he understood the command, the baby pushed off with his arms and more or less delivered himself into Charlie's outstretched hands. Sandy wiped off Sadie's face with a towel. Her eyes were glazed. Dried white mucus clung to the corners of her mouth, but she was smiling. I couldn't believe how small he was. He just sat there for a second in Charlie's hands, then blinked with those big, foggy, steel blue eyes, as if to say, "Where the hell am I?" Then he closed his eyes. Snake reached over with a pair of scissors and snipped the umbilical cord. Charlie tied it off with a piece of guitar string, then handed the baby to Brenda, who began to suck the mucus off his nose. Finally, Charlie gave him a pat on the ass, and he started to sputter and cry. Charlie grinned. Dig this little dude, will you, Mama? He held the baby out to Sadie. He's beautiful, honey, Sandy cooed. Isn't he just perfect? Moments later, the afterbirth plopped out like some amorphous jellyfish. The girls cleaned Sadie up, then made the bed for her in the back room. Charlie began dancing around the room with the guitar. composing capriccios and rhymes in honor of the new leader. Manson always claimed that the children were the real leaders. Unencumbered by well-developed egos, their responses were more instinctive and pure. They were always at now, which is where we wanted to be. Later, he took me aside and suggested we go someplace and figure out a name for the boy. So we piled into the pickup and drove around Chatsworth, concocting names and sobriquets of all kinds. By about 3 a.m., we'd considered hundreds of names. We were both exhausted. "Hey, why don't we just call him Caesar?" I finally suggested, half-heartedly. Hey, yeah, that's good, I like that. Yeah, maybe just Zizo." "What about Zizo ZZ?" "Right on." Charlie laughed. "Yeah, Zizo ZZ Zadfrak. How's that? Zizo ZZ Zadfrak." "Zizo ZZ Zadfrak. Sounds good to me." "Dig it. That way he'll always be at the end of the line, and the line will be long. He just won't wait in them. Years later, I would reflect back on the joy of that night, the unity of the family, the birth of Sadie's child, only to be jolted and repulsed by the chilling realization that just 1 year later, almost to the day, Sadie would butcher Sharon Tate and her unborn son. Even though we were pretty firmly ensconced at Spawns, during the first 3 months, Charlie had always had his eyes open for alternative headquarters. The family had moved frequently in the past, and we never knew when we might have to do so again. Bad vibes between Charlie and some of the cowboys had become increasingly apparent. It was for that reason that we cultivated a religious order just over the hill from Spawns, called the Fountain of the World. The Fountain was a non-profit spiritual order of men and women, primarily women, just north of Spawns in Box Canyon. It was an impressive complex, built at a bend in the gorge by a stream, almost hidden by oak trees and a sprawling, well-irrigated garden. The buildings, all constructed of hand-worked stone, included a chapel, 2 dormitories, and a small auditorium where daily meetings were held. To the right of the auditorium, on a knoll above the ground, a wooden cross was cemented into the ground. From a distance, the fountain looked like an ancient fortress hewn into the base of the canyon wall. One morning, not long after the birth of Zizos, Charlie woke me up and told me to come with him. I pulled on a pair of Levi's, a t-shirt, and my boots, and followed him out of the ranch house. We hiked up to the saloon where the pickup was parked and climbed in. Where are we headed? Charlie fired up the truck and backed it out onto the highway. The Fountain of the World. What? Charlie told me that he knew about it as we wound our way up Santa Susana Pass to Box Canyon and turned left. It might be a good place to hang out, hide under the cross when the shit comes down at Spawns. And the way Shorty's been running at the mouth, it might be any time. We got there around 10 a.m. and parked the truck on a hill, then trudged down the path to the auditorium. The place was about half full, and one of the brothers was already into his rap. He acknowledged us with a smile as we sat down. After a long, uninspired spiel proclaiming the virtues of moderation and human compassion, the speaker, tall, stoop-shouldered, and clad in a flowing full-length robe, told the history of the fountain and how Krishna Venta, its founder, had undergone a rigorous purification process, part of which included hanging on the cross for 3 days. Charlie sat beside me, fingering the beads around his neck, his hair long and uncombed down his back. He sniggered to himself as the speaker raised his arms to symbolize the crucifixion. For 3 days, the Honorable Krishnaventa remained pinioned on the cross you see there on the hillside. He gestured toward a window which fronted on the ravine. For 3 long days. Charlie couldn't contain himself. "Hey, brother, that ain't nothing," he blurted out, smiling. "Sir, that's nothing. 3 days ain't nothing. Paul could hang on the cross for a week. No problem. Right, Paul?" The audience, most of them brothers and sisters of the order, gawked at us. I was a little startled by Charlie's boast at first, but I knew his games pretty well then, and went along with it. "Sure," I grunted. "Sure, I could do that." "Come on," Charlie urged, getting to his feet. "Let's go on out there, Paul, so you can hang. Come on." I got up and started up the aisle, with Charlie right behind me. But as we stepped out the door, one of the brothers stopped us. "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's such a good idea. It might elicit some unfavorable publicity. You understand?" He gave Charlie an imploring yet conciliatory smile. Charlie chuckled. "Sure, brother," he said. "Maybe some other time." After that little episode, Charlie began sending contingents of girls to the fountain to work with the sisters, soliciting donations, passing out literature, and spreading the precepts of Krishnaventa. Sometimes they remained for days at a time, posing as devout and pious ladies of the cloth. But the family as a whole was never warmly received, and things didn't work out as Charlie had planned. We finally gave up on the fountain. We didn't learn until later that Shorty had paid them a visit. The irony of that whole scene, I later learned, was that Krishnaventa's family bore a striking resemblance to Charlie's. According to the records, the order was started when the honorable leader, sometime in the 50s, recruited a nucleus of women and a few men to enlighten the world with his spiritual teachings. But Krishnaventa's teachings were never, it appears, divorced from the pleasures of the flesh. Under his leadership, group sex, or what he likened to tantric transcendental self-realization, was a common practice. Most of his critics, however, included an irate husband of one of the sisters, didn't consider this form of self-realization quite kosher. One night, during a small service held in the chapel, that same husband arrived with a case of dynamite and blew Krishnaventa, himself, and 13 others to kingdom come. The ruins of that explosion were left intact as a monument to the order's founder. Charlie always thought that was a hilarious story.